Even the galactic elders avoid Earth, for one terrifying reason. The alarm in my chamber woke me before my second heart had finished its first beat. Red light. Not the soft blue of a routine update. Not the gentle chime of a data request. Red light meant someone had opened a file that had been sealed since before my species learned to build ships. I sat up so fast the room spun, and my assistant unit, a small floating sphere named Dell, hovered close and spoke in a voice tight with something I had never heard from a machine before. Fear. Cartographer Vecker, Dell said, the Sol system file has been accessed. You are the one who accessed it. I am required to ask if this was intentional. I stared at my own hands, still trembling from sleep, and I did not remember opening anything. I worked in the cartography wing of the Elder Compact, a place so old that some of its hallways had been carved before my planet had oceans. My job was simple. I updated star charts. I confirmed coordinates. I filed reports on systems that other archivists were too busy or too bored to visit. It was quiet work. It was safe work. Nothing about my life had ever included red lights. I pulled up the record on my console and saw my own authorization code stamped across a file labeled Sol System, Third Planet, Designation Earth. Beneath that label were words I had never seen attached to any star system in the entire catalog of the known galaxy. Do not engage, do not study, do not remember. I read it 3 times, and each time my breath came a little shorter. In all my years cataloging dead stars, dying moons, and civilizations too small or too young to matter, I had never once seen a warning like this. Not for the war fleets of the Thren, not for the poison clouds of the Uxbelt, not even for the black hole systems where entire fleets had vanished without a trace. Those files carried caution notices, danger ratings, advice on shielding and distance. This file carried something else entirely. It carried a command to forget. I should have closed it. Every instinct trained into me since childhood told me to close it, log the accidental access, and go back to sleep. The Elder Compact did not create blank spots in the map without reason, and reasons at that level of secrecy were rarely reasons a low-ranking cartographer needed to understand. But I have always had a flaw, one my instructors used to scold me for. I am curious in a way that does not know when to stop. So I opened the file wider. Most of it was empty. That alone was strange. Every other system in our records, even ones we had visited only once, carried thousands of data points. Atmospheric composition, gravitational readings, population estimates, cultural notes. The Sol system file had almost nothing. A single planet marked habitable. A single moon. A star of ordinary size and ordinary temperature. Nothing remarkable at all. And then, buried at the very bottom, one line that had clearly been added centuries after the rest. Exclusion zone status, permanent. Authorization to lift, none granted. None will be granted. Dell hovered closer, and I could hear the tiny mechanisms inside it, whirring faster than usual. The machine equivalent of nervous energy. Cartographer, Dell said, I would recommend closing this file and reporting the breach through proper channels. Why does a mostly empty file need this many locks? I asked. There is more security around this blank page than around the entire war archive of the Thren conflict. Dell did not answer right away, and that silence told me more than words could have. Machines like Dell did not hesitate. They calculated. When Dell finally spoke, its voice had dropped low, almost a whisper, as if it worried something might be listening. There are things in the deep archive that are not meant to be understood, Dell said, only avoided. I should tell you now, before I continue, that I am not a soldier. I am not an explorer. I have never held a weapon, never boarded an enemy vessel, never stood on a battlefield of any kind. I am, by nature and by training, a person who prefers quiet rooms and old records. But that night, sitting alone with a file that told an entire species not even to remember, something shifted inside me. I felt the same pull I imagine a swimmer feels standing at the edge of very dark water, knowing it is deeper than it looks, and stepping in anyway. I began searching for anyone who might explain the file to me. My first attempt was simple. I searched the Compact's public registry for scholars who had written about Earth. The search returned nothing. Not restricted results. Not limited results. Nothing. As if the very word Earth had been scrubbed from every academic paper, every historical record, every casual mention across 100,000 years of galactic scholarship. A civilization that had visited, studied, and cataloged nearly every corner of known space had somehow managed to produce 0 public words about one single planet. That absence frightened me more than any warning label could have. I decided to try something bolder. There was an elder living in residence not far from the cartography wing, one of the very old ones, a being who had existed since before most of our current governing structures had been formed. Elders like this rarely spoke to junior staff, they rarely spoke to anyone, but I had delivered reports to this particular elder before, small administrative tasks, and I hoped that thin connection might be enough to get me through the door. The elder's name was Orgath, and when I arrived at the entrance to their chamber, the air itself seemed heavier, thick with the kind of silence that comes from a very long life spent thinking about very large things. I announced myself, and after a pause long enough to make me doubt I would be allowed in at all, the door opened. Orgath sat near a wide window that looked out over the slow-turning lights of 1,000 distant systems, each one a pinprick of history, of memory, of civilizations known and catalogued. I bowed as I had been trained to do, and I explained, as carefully as I could, that I had come across an unusual file and hoped for guidance. "Which file?" Orgath asked, though something in their tone told me they already knew. "Sol system," I said. "Earth." The reaction was immediate, and it was unlike anything I had ever witnessed from a being of that age and composure. Orgath's long fingers, which had been resting calmly on the arm of their chair, curled inward, their breathing, usually slow and measured, caught for a moment, a small stumble in a rhythm that had likely been steady for longer than my entire civilization had existed. It was such a small thing, a single missed breath, but in a being that old, that controlled, it was the equivalent of a scream. "You should not know that name," Orgath said quietly. "I only wish to understand why," I said. "The file gives no information, only a warning." "The warning is the information," Orgath said, and for a long moment they simply looked at me, as if trying to decide whether I could be trusted, or perhaps whether it even mattered whether I could be trusted, because the danger was not about secrecy at all. "Do you know how old I am, young one?" I admitted that I did not know precisely, only that Orgath was counted among the oldest living members of the Compact. "I have watched empires rise from nothing and fall back into nothing," Orgath said. "I have seen weapons capable of unmaking stars. I have negotiated peace between species who wanted nothing more than to erase each other from existence. In all that time, across all those ages, there is only one thing that has ever made me afraid. Only one. Earth," I said. Orgath did not answer with words. They simply looked back out at the stars, and the silence stretched so long I began to wonder if the conversation was over. Then, finally, they spoke again, so quietly I had to lean forward to catch it. "We do not fear their weapons," Orgath said. "We have measured their weapons. They are unremarkable. Primitive, by galactic standards. No, young one. We fear what they do without them." I opened my mouth to ask what that meant, but Orgath raised a hand, and the gesture carried enough weight that I closed my mouth immediately. "I will tell you nothing more," Orgath said. "Not because I do not trust you, but because some knowledge changes the one who carries it. I have carried this knowledge for longer than your species has existed, and it has never once let me sleep peacefully. If you continue down this path, you will not be able to turn back. Consider that carefully before you take another step." I left the chamber that night with more questions than I had arrived with, and a strange, cold feeling settled into my chest, one that would not leave me for a very long time. I told myself I should heed the warning. I told myself I should return to my quiet work, my star charts, my safe and predictable life. But I did not sleep that night either. I lay awake thinking about a species with unremarkable weapons that had somehow made the oldest and most powerful beings in the galaxy, afraid to even speak their name. I thought about a file with almost nothing written in it, guarded more carefully than any archive of war. I thought about the phrase that would not leave my mind no matter how many times I tried to push it away. "We fear what they do without them." By morning, I had already decided. I would find out what that meant, no matter the cost. I requested access to the earliest recorded contact logs involving the Sol system, expecting my request to be denied instantly, expecting perhaps to be questioned about why a simple cartographer needed such files at all. Instead, to my surprise, the request was approved within moments, as if some part of the system wanted the truth to be found. Or perhaps as if no one had thought to build a wall around records that old, records so ancient that whoever sealed the main file had simply forgotten they existed. I did not know it then, but I was about to read words written by scouts who had approached Earth thousands of years earlier, full of confidence, expecting to catalog just another primitive world. I did not know that their confidence would not survive first contact. The scout log opened with a single timestamp, thousands of years old by the Compact's calendar, and a name I would come to know very well before the end of this story. Captain Edmund Cole, commander of a small survey vessel called the Wanderer's Reach, assigned to a routine mapping mission at the edge of an unremarkable star system. Nothing about the mission briefing suggested anything unusual. A yellow star, a rocky third planet with liquid water, and a thin, breathable atmosphere. The kind of world scouts cataloged 1,000 times a cycle without incident. I read Captain Cole's first entry with the calm detachment of someone expecting a routine report, and for a while, that is exactly what it was. Approaching designated system. Sensors show a single inhabited planet, third from the star. Preliminary scans detect low technology levels. Radio signals present but chaotic and undirected, consistent with an early industrial species. Recommend standard observation protocol. No immediate contact planned. I could almost picture Cole and his small crew settling into the familiar rhythm of a routine survey, cataloging weather patterns, mapping continents, listening to fragments of radio broadcasts drifting up from the surface like static whispers from a world that did not yet know it was being watched. For several entries, nothing changed. The tone stayed clinical, professional, bored even. Then the entries began to shift. Day 4. Radio signals more organized than initial assessment suggested. Multiple languages detected, indicating cultural fragmentation across the planet, rather than a single unified civilization. This is consistent with early-stage species. However, signal content is unusual. Frequent references to conflict, yet also frequent references to cooperation across vast distances despite conflict. Recommend closer observation. Day 7. Crew member Laura Bennett has raised concerns about a pattern in surface broadcasts. She reports that many transmissions describe events where local populations, facing what she calls impossible odds, continue resistance long after logical surrender would be expected. I have reviewed her findings and cannot yet explain the pattern. Recommend continued monitoring before drawing conclusions. I stopped reading for a moment, struck by something small but strange. In every other survey log I had ever read, scouts described primitive species with a kind of gentle condescension, noting their limitations, their fragility, their predictable behavior. Cole's tone here was different, careful, a little uncertain, as if he were describing something that did not fit neatly into any of the categories his training had prepared him for. I continued reading, and the entries grew longer, more detailed, more troubled. Day 12. Crew member Henry Marsh compiled a historical summary using intercepted broadcasts, translated by our language processors. The summary describes repeated instances across this species' recorded history where small, poorly equipped groups faced vastly superior forces and refused to surrender, even when survival seemed impossible by any reasonable calculation. In several instances, the poorly equipped side ultimately prevailed. This defies typical behavioral models for developing species, which generally show retreat or surrender as odds worsen beyond a certain threshold. This species shows the opposite pattern in a significant number of recorded cases. Flagging for further review. Day 15. I have ordered increased distance from the planet as a precaution, though I cannot fully articulate why. There has been no hostile action of any kind directed toward our vessel. The species below has no indication we exist. And yet something about the pattern Marsh identified troubles me more than any hostile fleet ever has. A species that grows more dangerous as its situation grows more hopeless is a species whose behavior cannot be reliably predicted using standard models. Predictability is the foundation of galactic peace. Without it, there is no way to calculate risk, and without a way to calculate risk, there is no way to guarantee safety. I sat back from the console, feeling a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the temperature of my chamber. I thought of every species I had ever studied in my work, every civilization cataloged neatly by aggression level, technological capability, and diplomatic tendency. The entire structure of the Elder Compact's peace, as I understood it, rested on the ability to predict how a species would behave under pressure. Species with strong technology and low aggression were welcomed. Species with strong technology and high aggression were monitored and, if necessary, contained. Species with weak technology were largely ignored, deemed too limited to pose any real threat regardless of their temperament. Earth did not fit anywhere in that structure. Weak technology, by galactic standards, and yet a pattern of behavior that made even a simple scouting mission cautious enough to keep its distance from an unarmed, unaware population. I kept reading. Day 20. Laura Bennett has proposed a limited, non-invasive contact attempt, arguing that direct observation would allow us to properly assess whether the patterns in historical broadcasts reflect the actual behavior of the current population, or whether they are, as some crew members have suggested, simply dramatized storytelling exaggerated for cultural or entertainment purposes. I have approved a very limited test. A small remote probe will be released into the upper atmosphere, designed to be undetectable by current technology levels on the surface. No physical contact, observation only. Day 22. The probe was detected. I read that line twice, certain I had misunderstood something in the translation. A probe designed by a species with the ability to travel between stars, built specifically to avoid detection by a species with, according to every sensor reading, only the earliest stages of space technology, had been detected. I kept reading, and Cole's log entries from this point forward grew noticeably shorter, more careful, as if he were choosing each word with great deliberation. Day 22. Continued. I do not yet understand how detection occurred. Our engineers insist the probe's signature should have been well beneath the threshold of current surface technology. Crew member Henry Marsh suggests the detection may not have come from technology at all, but from something less easily measured. He described it, somewhat uncomfortably, as a kind of persistent alertness in the population, a cultural tendency toward vigilance that does not appear in our standard behavioral models. I am uncertain how to log this observation in a way that will be useful to future analysis, but I feel it is important to record regardless. Day 23. Surface governments have begun coordinated efforts to track and identify the source of the detected object. This coordination occurred despite the fact that, according to our intercepted communications, several of these governments are in active states of conflict with one another. It is unusual, by the standards of every other species I have observed, for rival factions to set aside conflict this quickly in response to an external unknown. I am recommending immediate withdrawal to a safe distance while we reassess the mission. I found myself leaning closer to the console, drawn in by something I had not expected from what was supposed to be a routine survey report. There was a tension building in Cole's words, a barely restrained unease from a commander who had clearly begun this mission expecting nothing remarkable at all. Day 25. We have withdrawn to the edge of the system, well beyond any reasonable detection range. I want to record, for whoever reads this file in the future, that I do not believe this species poses any immediate threat to our vessel or our mission. We were never in physical danger, and yet I have never, in my years of service, felt as unsettled as I did watching a population of primitive, technologically limited beings identify and respond to a threat they should not have been capable of detecting, using nothing but coordination, persistence, and what I can only describe as an unwillingness to simply accept the unknown and move on. Day 26. Final entry before departure. I am recommending this system be flagged for long-term observation only, with strict limits on any future contact. My reasoning is difficult to summarize in a single line, but I will attempt it here for the record. Every species we have catalogued behaves according to patterns shaped by risk and reward, by the calculation of what can be won against what might be lost. This species appears, based on limited but consistent evidence, to calculate differently. When the odds turn against them, their response is not retreat. It is an increase in effort, in coordination, in resolve. I do not know why. I do not know what shapes a species to behave this way, but I believe, and I say this with the full weight of my responsibility as commander of this vessel, that any future encounter with this species should proceed with extreme caution, regardless of how limited their current technology may appear. The log ended there. I sat in silence for a long time after reading Cole's final words, turning them over again and again in my mind. A survey mission that began as routine as any other had ended with a seasoned commander recommending permanent caution around a species with what our own sensors classified as primitive technology. I thought about Orgath's words in their chamber. We do not fear their weapons. We fear what they do without them. I had thought, reading that phrase for the first time, that it referred to some hidden capability, some secret arsenal humanity had developed beyond what the galaxy could detect. But Cole's log suggested something different, something stranger. It was not about hidden weapons at all. It was about what happened inside a human mind when every weapon, every advantage, every reasonable path to survival had already been taken away. I needed to know if this pattern Cole and his crew had documented was a single unusual case, an anomaly born from one small, unrepresentative slice of a very large and complicated population, or if it was something deeper, something that ran through the entire history of this strange, isolated species like a single unbroken thread. I opened a new search, this time reaching further into the archive, searching for every fragment of recorded human history the Compact had managed to gather across the centuries since Cole's mission. I did not expect what I found. I did not expect that the pattern would not just repeat. I did not expect that it would repeat every single time, across every recorded era, without a single exception. The deeper archive was not organized the way the rest of the Compact's records were organized. Most files followed a clean, predictable structure, sorted by era, by region, by species. The human records were scattered, fragmented, pieced together from centuries of quiet, cautious observation, carried out by scouts who never landed, never made contact, and never stayed longer than they had to. It took me 3 full days simply to gather everything into a single timeline I could study properly. What I found, once I laid it all out in order, made my hands go cold. The first fragment came from an observer named Grace Whitfield, stationed on a listening post far beyond the edge of the solar system centuries after Cole's original mission. Her assignment was passive monitoring only, gathering broadcast signals and translating them for the archive. Her notes were dry at first, focused on technological development, population growth, simple economic data. Then, buried in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable report, I found this entry. I have been reviewing historical records transmitted from the surface regarding a period referred to locally as a great conflict between opposing alliances. According to translated accounts, one faction found itself surrounded, cut off from resupply, facing an enemy with superior numbers and superior equipment. Standard behavioral models predict surrender within a narrow window once resource depletion reaches a certain threshold. Surface records indicate this faction instead continued resistance for a duration nearly 4 times longer than the model predicted, ultimately forcing the opposing alliance to divert resources that altered the larger outcome of the conflict. I am flagging this for pattern comparison against the findings of Captain Cole's original survey mission. I sat with that entry for a long moment before continuing. It was not simply that humans fought longer than expected. It was that their persistence actually changed outcomes, forced larger powers to adapt, bent the shape of events around their refusal to accept the ending that logic demanded. I moved forward through the timeline, and the pattern did not fade. It sharpened. A second observer, a scholar named Peter Hale, working nearly a full century after Whitfield, had been assigned to study a period of widespread disaster on the human homeworld, a series of natural catastrophes that struck several regions in close succession. His notes carried the same careful clinical tone I had come to recognize from every human observer in the archive, the tone of someone trying very hard to remain professionally detached from something that unsettled them. Following the disaster events, standard behavioral models predict a measurable decline in cooperative behavior among survivors, driven by resource scarcity and increased competition for remaining supplies. This pattern holds true across nearly every species cataloged by the Compact. Surface records from the affected regions show the opposite trend. Cooperative behavior increased substantially in the immediate aftermath of the disasters, with unaffected regions voluntarily redirecting significant resources to affected populations, despite no formal treaty or governing structure requiring them to do so. Volunteer efforts, organized without centralized command, appeared within hours of each event. I have reviewed this data multiple times, suspecting an error in translation or interpretation. I have found no error. The pattern is consistent and appears throughout the historical record I have been given access to. I began to notice something as I moved further through the collected fragments. Each observer, working decades or even centuries apart from the last, without any knowledge of what those before them had documented, kept arriving at the same conclusion, through entirely separate paths. It was as if the pattern was so consistent, so deeply woven into the behavior of this species, that it was almost impossible for an outside observer to miss it, no matter which slice of human history they happened to be studying. The next fragment troubled me more than the others. It came from an observer named Nora Bishop, assigned to monitor a period of extended technological competition between two of the largest human factions, a tense standoff that intercepted broadcasts referred to using language suggesting both sides possessed the capability to cause catastrophic, possibly extinction-level damage to their own world. Bishop's notes were longer than most, and I could feel, even through the clinical structure of her reporting, a kind of quiet unease running beneath every line. I have spent considerable time attempting to model the decision-making process of both factions during this standoff, using standard risk assessment frameworks developed for species with comparable technological capability. Under normal modeling conditions, a standoff of this magnitude, involving weapons capable of ending a civilization, should produce one of two outcomes within a relatively short window, either de-escalation through negotiated agreement, or catastrophic failure resulting in the destruction predicted by the weapons themselves. This standoff continued for decades without producing either outcome. Neither faction fully de-escalated. Neither faction used the weapons in question. Instead, both factions appeared to settle into an extended state of tension, each apparently calculating that the other's willingness to risk total destruction, rather than back down, made any aggressive action too dangerous to attempt. I want to note for the record that this behavior does not match any model I am familiar with from Compact archives regarding other species facing comparable standoffs. In most cataloged cases, at least one side eventually backs away from the brink once the personal cost becomes clear to individual decision-makers. Human decision-makers, across multiple recorded instances, appear willing to accept that personal cost, rather than be the side that backs away first. I read that final line several times. Willing to accept that personal cost, rather than be the side that backs away first. I thought about Orgath's warning again, the missed breath, the fear in the eyes of a being who had outlived empires. I thought about Cole's log, his careful, unsettled observations about a species that grew more dangerous rather than less as circumstances worsened. And now here was a third, completely independent observer, reaching the same unsettling conclusion from a completely different angle. This was not an isolated incident. This was not one strange chapter in an otherwise ordinary history. This was the pattern itself, repeating across every era, every conflict, every disaster the compact had ever managed to observe from a careful, cautious distance. I pressed further into the archive, and the next fragment I found was different from the others, not because the pattern changed, but because of who had written it. The name attached to this entry was Edward Voss, and according to the file's metadata, Voss had not been a passive observer working from a listening post. Voss had commanded a vessel that came far closer to the human homeworld than any recorded mission before or since, close enough to conduct detailed atmospheric and structural analysis of surface settlements. His report was the longest I had found, and the most carefully worded, as if every sentence had been reviewed and revised multiple times before being committed to the permanent record. I am submitting this report with full awareness that it may be used to justify permanent restrictions on future contact with this species, and I want to be clear that I believe such restrictions would be justified, though perhaps not for the reasons that will first come to mind. This species does not possess technology capable of threatening a vessel such as mine. Their weapons, while dangerous to themselves and to each other, pose no meaningful risk to any compact vessel or installation. If risk were measured purely in terms of technological capability, this system would warrant no special designation at all. I am recommending restriction for a different reason entirely, one I have struggled to articulate clearly even to myself. During my approach, I conducted passive observation of several ongoing conflicts across different regions of the planet. In every single instance, without exception, I observed the same underlying behavior. When a group within this species reaches what should be, by any reasonable calculation, the end of viable resistance, something changes. Effort does not decrease. It increases. Coordination improves. Innovation accelerates. I watched populations with severely limited resources develop workarounds and adaptations within days that should have taken far longer under normal technological development timelines. I watched individuals who had already lost everything they might reasonably fight to protect continue fighting regardless, not because logic demanded it, but seemingly because something else entirely was driving the behavior, something our behavioral models are not equipped to measure or predict. I want to state plainly what concerns me most about this pattern. Every species the compact has ever cataloged, including our own, follows a recognizable curve of effort and resolve that rises and then falls as a conflict becomes more hopeless. This is not a flaw. This is a survival mechanism, one that prevents species from destroying themselves entirely in pursuit of causes that can no longer be won. It is, in a sense, the foundation of galactic peace itself, because it means that even the most aggressive species eventually reaches a point where continued conflict becomes unappealing compared to survival. This species does not appear to follow that curve, or if they do, the point at which their resolve breaks lies so far beyond what any other species experiences that it becomes, for practical purposes, unreachable. I sat back from the console after reading Voss's words, feeling the full weight of what he was describing settle over me. It was not that humans were unusually strong, or unusually well-armed, or unusually numerous. It was that the internal mechanism every other species relied upon, the quiet, instinctive understanding of when a cause had become unwinnable, simply did not function the same way inside them. Or if it did function, it required a pressure so extreme that nothing in recorded history had yet found its limit. Voss's report continued for several more pages, detailing specific observations, specific conflicts, specific moments where populations facing what should have been certain defeat had instead adapted, endured, and in a significant number of cases, ultimately prevailed. But it was his closing statement that stayed with me longest, the words that I would find myself returning to again and again in the days that followed. I am recommending that this system be permanently restricted from contact, not because I believe this species intends harm toward the compact, and not because I believe they currently possess the capability to cause harm even if they intended it. I am recommending restriction because I do not believe we can accurately predict the behavior of a species whose response to hopeless circumstances is the opposite of every other species we have ever encountered. A predictable enemy can be managed. A predictable threat can be contained. This species, based on every piece of evidence I have gathered, is not predictable in the way our models require for safe management, and an unpredictable variable of unknown eventual capability, left alone to grow and develop without our interference, is, in my professional judgment, far more dangerous in the long term than any known threat currently cataloged within compact space. I closed the file and sat in the silence of my chamber for a long time, the glow of the console the only light in the room. I thought about the vote Orgath had mentioned, the sealed status of the file, the almost complete erasure of any public record even acknowledging Earth existed. I understood now, or thought I did, why the compact had chosen silence over study, distance over contact. But understanding the reason did not make the fear any smaller. If anything, it made it worse, because now I understood exactly what Orgath had meant. and exactly why even a being who had outlived 100 civilizations still could not speak that name without their breath catching in their throat. I still did not know, however, what had actually happened the one time the compact had come close enough to test this theory directly. I still did not know what the archive kept referring to, only in careful, guarded fragments, as the incident, and something told me, as I stared at that word buried in Voss's closing notes, that finding the answer would change everything I thought I understood about the quiet, careful silence the galaxy had built around one small blue world. Finding the incident meant finding records that lay even deeper than anything I had accessed so far, and for that, I needed a key I did not have. My cartographer clearance opened doors meant for archivists, historians, mapmakers. It did not open doors meant for the Elder Council. I spent 2 full days searching for a way around this problem before I remembered something small, something I had nearly forgotten in my growing fascination with Cole and Whitfield and Voss. Orgeth had let me into their chamber once already. Perhaps, I thought, they might let me in again. I did not expect a warm welcome, and I did not receive one. When I arrived at the chamber door this time, it did not open right away. I stood in the corridor for what felt like a very long time, aware that somewhere behind that door, an ancient and powerful being was deciding whether I had become a problem that needed to be handled, or simply a curious young archivist who deserved one more conversation before being firmly redirected back to my star charts. Eventually the door opened, and Orgath's expression, when I stepped inside, was not angry. It was tired, in a way that seemed to stretch back further than I could comprehend. "You did not stop," Orgath said. It was not a question. "I found the survey logs," I said. "Cole, Whitfield, Voss." I read what they wrote. I understand now why the file carries the warning it carries, but I still do not understand what happened. I do not understand what the archive calls the incident. Orgath was silent for a long moment, studying me with eyes that had watched the birth and death of more worlds than I could count. Finally, they gestured toward a chair across from their own, and I sat, sensing that something had shifted, that whatever careful line Orgath had been walking between protecting me and protecting the secret had finally tipped in a new direction. "I am going to show you something few beings outside the Council have ever seen," Orgath said. "Not because I believe you are ready for it. I do not think anyone is ever truly ready for it. But because I believe you will find your way to it eventually regardless, and I would rather you understand it properly than stumble into it alone, the way I once did." A small projection flickered to life above the table between us, and I recognized immediately what I was looking at. A council chamber, ancient even by the standards of the room I now sat in, filled with representatives from dozens of species, all gathered for what the header of the recording identified as an emergency session, convened shortly after Voss's report had been filed. I leaned forward as the recording began to play. The presiding elder, a being whose name I did not recognize, opened the session with a summary of Voss's findings, delivered in the same careful, clinical tone I had come to associate with every report about Earth I had read so far. When the summary ended, the chamber erupted into overlapping voices, dozens of representatives speaking at once, and Orgath paused the recording briefly to explain. "The council was divided," Orgath said, "not on whether the species was dangerous. Everyone in that room agreed on that point immediately. The division was on what to do about it." The recording resumed, and I watched as the debate unfolded across what the timestamp indicated was nearly 3 full days of continuous session. One faction, led by a representative I would later learn was named Charles Grant, argued forcefully for immediate, careful contact, made before humanity developed the technology to travel beyond its own system. "If we wait," Grant's translated voice argued, "we wait only until this species possesses the capability to match the danger their temperament already suggests. Right now, they are contained by their own limitations. Every year we delay is a year closer to a moment when containment is no longer possible. I propose careful, controlled contact, an attempt to build understanding and trust while the balance of power remains firmly in our favor. If we can teach them to see us as partners rather than threats, we may be able to guide the direction their development takes." Another representative, a being named Alice Ferris, argued the opposite position with equal intensity. "Every report we have gathered describes a species whose behavior we cannot reliably predict under pressure," Ferris argued. "Contact itself is a form of pressure. We do not know how this species would respond to the sudden revelation that it is not alone, that it has been watched, studied, and judged by outside powers for generations without its knowledge or consent. I do not believe we can predict that reaction with any confidence, and given everything we have learned about how they respond to circumstances they perceive as threatening, I am not willing to risk finding out." The debate continued, voice after voice, and I watched Orgath's face as the recording played, noting the way their expression had grown distant, as if the memory carried a weight that had not lessened with time despite how many centuries had passed since that chamber had emptied. You were there, I said quietly. I was young then, Orgath said. Younger than you, by our reckoning. I remember believing, foolishly, that the vote would be simple, that reasonable beings, presented with clear evidence, would reach a clear conclusion. I learned otherwise in that chamber. The recording moved forward, and I watched the debate narrow, eventually, to a single proposed vote. Contact, controlled and careful, offered while the compact still held every advantage. Or silence, permanent and absolute, a decision to never approach the species at all, to erase the knowledge of its existence from public record as thoroughly as possible, and to hope that distance alone would be enough to prevent whatever danger Voss's report had warned of. The vote, when it finally came, was close, painfully close, according to the recorded tally, close enough that a handful of representatives switched their position in the final hours of debate, close enough that the outcome had genuinely hung in the balance until the very last moment. Silence won. Why? I asked, once the recording ended, and the chamber above the table faded back into empty air. If contact might have built trust, might have let us guide their development, why choose silence instead? Why choose to hide rather than to try? Orgath was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when they finally spoke, their voice carried something I had not heard from them before. Not fear this time, something closer to grief. Because contact assumes trust can be built before danger arrives, Orgath said, and the Council could not agree on how much time we truly had before this species developed the capability to travel among the stars themselves. Grant argued we had generations. Ferris argued we might have far less. In the end, the Council chose the option that required the least prediction, the least assumption about a species whose behavior our best models could not reliably forecast. Silence does not require us to guess correctly about how they would respond to contact. It simply requires distance, and distance is something we know how to maintain. But that is not the whole reason, I said, watching Orgath's face carefully. Is it? Orgath looked at me for a long moment, and something in their ancient eyes told me I had guessed correctly. No, Orgath admitted quietly, it is not the whole reason. There was one more piece of evidence presented near the end of that session, evidence that arrived only hours before the final vote, evidence that I believe tipped the balance more than any argument made in that chamber over the previous 3 days combined. What evidence? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer, already felt the cold certainty settling into my chest before Orgath even said the word. A message, Orgath said, from a scouting fleet that had, against every standing order, attempted direct contact with a stranded human vessel, found drifting far beyond their home system. I was not present for what followed. Very few beings outside that fleet were, but the report that reached the Council that night was enough to end the debate entirely, and enough to ensure that no Council since has ever seriously proposed reopening contact with that world. Orgath rose from their chair, moving slowly toward the window, and for a long moment they simply looked out at the distant lights scattered across the dark, the same view I imagined they had looked at 1,000 times across 1,000 years of careful, guarded silence. You wanted to understand the incident, Orgath said finally. I will show you what remains of that report, but I want you to understand, before you see it, that what you are about to witness is the reason an entire galaxy of species, older and more powerful than humanity, has spent generations pretending their world does not exist. Once you have seen it, you will understand why. The file Orgath brought forward was labeled differently from anything I had seen before. No survey number, no mission designation, only a single word, stamped in red across the header. Restricted. Beneath it, a second line, added later in a different hand. Council eyes only, permanent seal, do not distribute. This report was never meant to leave that council chamber, Orgath said, settling back into their chair with the slow, careful movement of someone bracing for something unpleasant. I have kept a copy for reasons I have never fully explained, even to myself. Perhaps some part of me always knew that someday, someone would ask the right questions, and I did not want the truth to disappear entirely, even if it could never be spoken openly. The recording began not with a council session, but with raw fleet communications, the kind of unfiltered, unedited transmissions that were normally stripped away and summarized before ever reaching official records. I heard voices layered over each other, urgent, controlled, the practiced calm of trained officers trying to maintain protocol even as something clearly began to unravel around them. The fleet, according to the header data, had been assigned to a routine deep space patrol far beyond the edge of the Sol exclusion zone, well outside the boundary humans were believed capable of reaching with their limited technology. The patrol's own logs, which Orgath let me review first, described the discovery of a small, damaged human vessel, drifting without power, far further from its home system than any human craft should have been able to travel given known technological limits. Fleet Commander Log, first entry. We have discovered a vessel of human design, drifting and unpowered, at a distance from the Sol system that exceeds all current estimates of their propulsion capability by a significant margin. This discovery alone represents a serious gap in our intelligence regarding this species' technological development. I am recommending immediate withdrawal and reporting per standing exclusion protocol. I paused the recording. They found a human ship this far out, I said. That alone should have been alarming enough. It was, Orgath said, but the commander of that fleet made a decision that night that violated every standing order regarding contact with this species. Continue. I resumed the recording, and the next entry carried a different tone, hesitant, almost apologetic, as if the commander already knew they were making a mistake even as they committed it to the official log. Second entry. Sensors indicate faint life signs aboard the drifting vessel. Standing orders require withdrawal without contact in any encounter involving this species. However, given the extraordinary nature of this discovery, and the apparent presence of survivors in critical condition, I am authorizing a limited rescue and containment operation. My reasoning is this: if this species has already developed propulsion technology capable of reaching this distance from their home system, the value of direct intelligence gathered from survivors may outweigh the risk of limited, controlled contact. I take full responsibility for this decision. What followed was not a battle. I want to be clear about that, because some part of me had expected, based on everything I had read leading up to this point, some grand confrontation, weapons fire, destruction on a massive scale. What actually happened was smaller, quieter, and somehow far more unsettling because of it. The fleet's boarding team, according to the logs, entered the drifting vessel expecting to find a small crew, injured and helpless, easily secured and contained for study. Instead, they found 3 survivors. 3. Out of what appeared to have been a larger original crew complement based on the vessel's size, the survivors, weakened by exposure and limited resources, offered no immediate resistance when first discovered, and the boarding team's initial reports described the operation as proceeding smoothly, almost routine. Then something changed. I am recording this exchange as accurately as I am able, the boarding team leader's voice said, and I could hear something in that voice now, a tightness that had not been there moments before. Survivors were being moved toward transport for containment and medical assessment. One survivor, later identified through recovered vessel records as Margaret Doyle, resisted physical restraint despite being severely weakened and clearly outmatched by boarding personnel in every measurable capacity. When restraint was applied, a second survivor, identified as Charles Grant, no relation to the council representative of the same name, attempted to intervene despite visible injuries that should have made such action physically impossible according to standard medical assessment. I stopped the recording again, my hands unsteady on the console. 2 injured, weakened survivors resisted an entire boarding team, I said. That is the incident. That is what changed the vote. Orgath shook their heads slowly. That is only the beginning of it, they said. Keep listening. The recording continued, and the boarding team leader's voice grew steadily more strained as the account went on. 3rd survivor, identified as Peter Hale, appeared to be in the most critical condition of the 3, showing signs of severe injury consistent with the vessel's damage. He was, by every reasonable medical assessment available to us, incapable of meaningful physical action. When boarding personnel moved to restrain the 2nd survivor, this 3rd individual disabled a containment mechanism using what our engineers later determined was improvised knowledge of technology he should have had no prior exposure to. Technology fundamentally different from anything developed on his home world. I do not have a satisfying explanation for how this was possible. I can only report what our own sensor logs confirmed independently of any crew testimony. No one aboard that vessel died in the encounter that followed, and I want to state that clearly, because I think it matters. This was not a story of destruction or slaughter or overwhelming force meeting a tragic end. It was something stranger, something that unsettled the fleet far more than casualties ever could have. Final entry from the boarding operation. Containment was ultimately achieved, though not without significant complication. I want to record, for whoever reviews this file, an observation that I believe is more important than any tactical detail included above. Every survivor recovered from that vessel was, by any reasonable measure, beyond the point where continued resistance served any practical purpose. They were outnumbered, outmatched, facing a force with overwhelming technological and physical advantage. There was no scenario in which their resistance could have altered the outcome of the encounter, and yet resistance did not diminish. As the situation grew more hopeless, it intensified. I do not believe this behavior can be explained through standard models of self-preservation or tactical calculation. I believe, and I say this with full awareness of how it may be received, that we encountered something in that vessel that our current frameworks are not equipped to properly understand. The recording ended there, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Orgath did not speak for a long time, watching me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between sympathy and something that looked almost like relief, as if a burden they had carried alone for a very long time had finally, in some small way, been shared. 3 survivors, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Not a fleet, not an army. 3 injured, exhausted, outnumbered people, and it was enough to end a council vote that had been evenly divided for 3 days. It was not the resistance itself that ended the debate, Orgath said quietly. It was what it implied. 3 ordinary individuals, stripped of every advantage, facing a force they could not possibly overcome, did not calculate the odds and surrender. They did not even hesitate, and if 3 ordinary people, chosen by nothing more than chance and circumstance, could behave this way when cornered, the council could no longer convince itself that this was some rare exception, some unusual outlier buried among billions. It began to look, instead, like the baseline, like the default setting of an entire species. I thought of Cole's log, his careful unease. I thought of Voss's closing words, his warning about a species whose resolve seemed to have no measurable ceiling. And now I understood, with a clarity that settled cold and heavy in my chest, exactly what that meant when tested directly, when 3 frightened, injured people faced an entire fleet and simply refused to stop. What happened to them? I asked. The survivors. Orgath's expression shifted, and for the first time since I had entered that chamber, I saw something that looked almost like shame cross their ancient face. That, Orgath said quietly, is a part of the story the council has worked very hard to ensure no one ever asks about again. Orgath's silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if they would answer at all. When they finally spoke again, their voice had lost some of the careful, measured quality I had grown used to, replaced by something rawer, something closer to the voice of someone finally setting down a weight they had carried for far too long. The 3 survivors were held for a period of study, Orgath said, not harmed. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories can be imagined to end, and that is not what happened here. The fleet commander who authorized the initial contact understood, even then, the danger of mistreating beings who had already demonstrated a willingness to resist far beyond any reasonable expectation. They were given medical care. They were treated, within the limits of the situation, with caution and respect. But they were still prisoners, I said. They were, Orgath agreed. And that is where the second part of this story begins. The part that convinced the council, once and for all, that silence was the only safe path forward. I leaned forward, unable to look away from the projection now dimmed between us, waiting. During the period of study, Orgath continued, the 3 survivors did not simply endure their captivity. Margaret Doyle, the first survivor to resist during the boarding operation, began, almost immediately, to study her captors in return. She learned patterns, shift changes, security routines. She did this while recovering from injuries that should have left her incapacitated for weeks. Charles Grant, despite significant physical limitations, began building a rapport with lower-ranking fleet personnel, asking careful questions, offering information about his own species in exchange for small pieces of information about the fleet's operations and technology. And Peter Hale, the one who had disabled a containment mechanism using knowledge he should not have possessed, continued to study every piece of technology he encountered with an intensity that unsettled even the scientists assigned to observe him. They were planning something, I said quietly. They were adapting, Orgath corrected. There is a difference, and it is a difference that mattered a great deal to the council when they reviewed the final report. A prisoner who plans a single escape attempt is dangerous in a limited, containable way. A prisoner who spends every waking moment quietly learning, adapting, and improving their position, without any apparent limit to how long they are willing to continue doing so, is a different kind of danger altogether. I thought of the pattern I had already traced through centuries of human history, resistance that intensified rather than faded, innovation that accelerated under pressure rather than stalling, cooperation that increased in the face of disaster rather than collapsing into competition. Here it was again, the same pattern, playing out not across an entire civilization, but inside the walls of a single containment facility, carried by 3 individuals who had every reason to believe their situation was permanent and hopeless. How long were they held? I asked. Long enough, Orgath said, for the fleet commander to realize that containment itself was becoming a liability rather than a solution. The survivors were not simply waiting for rescue. They were building, piece by piece, an understanding of the fleet's capabilities that would have made them extraordinarily dangerous if they were ever returned to their own people. And they were doing it not through any special technology or hidden advantage, but through sheer, unrelenting persistence, applied continuously, without any sign of the resolve weakening over time. So what did the fleet commander do? I asked. Orgath was quiet for a moment, and when they answered, their voice carried a note of something I had not expected. Respect, mixed uneasily with the fear that had colored every conversation we had shared so far. They released them, Orgath said, returned them, quietly, to a location near their home system, with their memories of the encounter deliberately clouded, using technology the compact reserves for only the most sensitive situations. The fleet commander's final report to the council argued that continued containment carried greater long-term risk than release. Because every day the survivors remained in custody, they grew more capable of eventually escaping, or worse, of eventually teaching their captors' own weaknesses back to their own people, through channels no one had yet identified. They were afraid of 3 injured people, I said, still struggling to fully accept the scale of what that implied. An entire fleet, with every technological advantage imaginable, decided the safest option was to let them go, rather than continue holding them. Yes, Orgath said simply, and when that report reached the council, alongside Voss's earlier findings and centuries of quiet pattern recognition gathered by observers like Whitfield and Bishop and Hale, the vote that had been evenly divided for 3 days ended within a single hour. Silence was chosen not because anyone believed this species intended harm. It was chosen because no one in that chamber could construct a model of contact, negotiation, or even careful limited engagement that did not eventually risk placing this species in a position where their unique behavior might be triggered against the compact itself. I sat back, trying to absorb everything Orgath had just told me, feeling the shape of the entire secret finally settling into place. It was not a story about weapons, or fleets, or overwhelming force. It was a story about 3 ordinary injured people who simply refused to stop adapting, refused to stop resisting, refused to accept that their situation was as hopeless as every calculation suggested it should be. There is one more thing, Orgath said, and something in their tone made me go very still. Something the council has never fully resolved, even after all these centuries. What is that? I asked. We do not know, Orgath said slowly, whether the memory suppression used on those 3 survivors actually held. The technology was reliable against every species we had tested it on before. But we had never tested it against this species, under these particular circumstances, and in the centuries since their release, the Council has never been able to confirm, one way or another, whether Margaret Doyle, Charles Grant, and Peter Hale ever fully forgot what happened to them, or whether some fragment of that encounter remained, buried somewhere in their minds, in their stories, in the culture of a species already inclined, long before that encounter ever happened, toward exactly the kind of stubborn, unyielding persistence that had frightened an entire fleet into releasing them, rather than risk holding them a single day longer. I left Orgath's chamber that night carrying a weight I did not know how to set down. For days afterward, I could not return to my ordinary work. Star charts that had once felt satisfying now felt small, almost meaningless, compared to what I now understood about the quiet, careful fear that shaped one entire corner of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful alliance. I found myself returning, again and again, to a single question that Orgath's account had not fully answered. If the compact possessed the technology to erase an entire species, why had no one, in all the centuries since that first incident, ever simply chosen to do so? Fear alone did not usually stop the compact from acting. I had studied enough history to know that other dangerous species had been contained, weakened, or in the darkest chapters of galactic history, removed entirely when their behavior was judged too great a risk to tolerate. I brought this question back to Orgath during my next visit, and this time, they did not hesitate before answering, as if they had been waiting for me to ask it all along. You are correct, that the compact has, in its long history, made difficult decisions about dangerous species, Orgath said. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not pretend those decisions were made lightly, or that I am proud of every choice the Council has made across the ages. But every one of those decisions was made using models we trusted, models built on centuries of observed, predictable behavior. We understood, with reasonable confidence, how those species would respond to pressure, to loss, to the approach of their own ending. That understanding allowed the Council to weigh outcomes, to calculate risk, to choose a path forward with some confidence that the calculation itself was sound. And with humanity, I said, already anticipating the answer. With humanity, every model breaks down, Orgath said. Consider what you have already learned. A species whose resolve does not weaken as circumstances worsen, but strengthens. A species whose cooperation increases rather than collapses during disaster. 3 individuals who, stripped of every advantage and facing an entire fleet, adapted and resisted rather than surrendered. Now imagine attempting to calculate the outcome of an action intended to end that species entirely. What does a species like this do in its final moment, when there is truly nothing left to lose? We do not know. No model we have ever built can answer that question with any confidence, because every model we have is built on the assumption that resolve fades as hope fades. This species appears to break that assumption entirely. I turned this over in my mind, feeling the shape of the Council's true fear finally becoming clear. It was not that humanity might defeat the compact in open conflict. Every technological measure suggested that outcome was, at least for now, essentially impossible. The fear was something stranger, something harder to defend against. The fear that an attempt to eliminate the threat might, in the act of trying, awaken exactly the kind of response that made the threat catastrophic in the first place. There was a simulation, Orgath said quietly, run not long after the incident, by some of the Compact's most capable strategists. They attempted to model the outcome of a full, decisive strike against the Sol system, using overwhelming force delivered without warning, intended to end the threat before it could ever grow beyond its home system. What did the simulation predict, I asked. Total destruction of the target, in the most straightforward technical sense, Orgath said. The simulation had no difficulty predicting that outcome, if the strike were carried out with sufficient force and no advance warning. But the strategists were required, as part of standard modeling procedure, to also account for uncertainty, for variables the simulation could not fully resolve. And it was there that the model broke down entirely. No one could confidently predict what happens to information, to warnings, to fragments of knowledge, in the hours or days before a strike of that scale could be fully executed. No one could guarantee that every trace of advance movement, every preparation, every signal, could be hidden completely from a species that had already demonstrated, more than once, an unsettling ability to detect what should have been undetectable. You are saying they might have known it was coming, I said slowly. We are saying we could not prove they would not know, Orgath said, and a species with the behavior pattern this one has demonstrated, given even a small amount of warning, given even the smallest window to prepare, becomes an entirely different kind of problem. Every fragment of history you have already studied tells the same story. This is a species that does its most dangerous work not when it is comfortable, not when it is safe, but precisely in those final desperate hours when everything else has already failed. The strategists could not rule out the possibility that an attempted strike, rather than ending the threat, might instead accelerate exactly the kind of development the Council feared most, compressed into a period of desperate, unified effort unlike anything this species had produced before, because for the first time in their history, the threat would not be internal, or regional, or divided among themselves. It would be singular, external, and undeniable. I sat with that thought for a long time, feeling its full weight settle over me. The Compact had not chosen silence because it lacked the strength to act. It had chosen silence because every path toward action led to the same unbearable uncertainty, the same inability to predict what a cornered, desperate, unified humanity might become if given even the smallest reason to unite against a single, external threat. There is something else, Orgath added, after a long pause. Something the strategists included in their final report, almost as an afterthought, though I have always believed it was the most important line in the entire document. What was it, I asked. They wrote that the greatest danger this species poses is not what they are today, Orgath said. It is what they might become, if ever given a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting, together, toward a single shared purpose. Every conflict in their recorded history, every disaster, every hopeless standoff you have already studied, involved this species divided against itself, resisting in small, scattered pockets, rather than as a unified whole. The Council has never been able to answer, with any confidence, what happens if that ever changes, and no one, in all the centuries since that report was filed, has ever been willing to be the one who finds out. I thought of Voss's closing words, echoing now with a new and heavier meaning. An unpredictable variable of unknown eventual capability, left alone to grow and develop without our interference, is far more dangerous in the long term than any known threat currently catalogued. I understood now what he had meant. It was not simply that humanity's behavior could not be predicted in the moment. It was that their potential, their ceiling, their final form as a species, remained an open question that no one in the galaxy had ever dared to test. And somewhere, deep in that understanding, a new question began to form in my mind, one that I would not be able to ignore for much longer. If the Compact truly believed distance and silence were the only safe path forward, why did some small, stubborn part of me still feel drawn toward that quiet, dangerous corner of the galaxy, wanting, more than anything, to see this impossible species with my own eyes? I did not tell Orgath what I planned to do next. I am not certain even now whether that silence was born from fear that they would try to stop me, or from a quieter, more uncomfortable fear that they might simply let me go, having already accepted, somewhere in their long and careful life, that some questions cannot be answered from the safety of a chamber filled with old records and older warnings. Arranging passage to the edge of the Sol exclusion zone was more difficult than I expected. Most transport routes near that region had been quietly redirected centuries ago, folded into longer, less efficient paths that carried travelers around the area without ever drawing attention to why. I eventually found a small survey vessel bound for a neighboring system. Its captain, a weathered trader named Grace Ellery, who asked no questions when I offered a generous payment in exchange for a slight detour and a few hours of unsupervised access to her observation deck. The journey took longer than I expected, long enough that I had ample time to reconsider everything I was about to do, and ample time to decide, again and again, that I would not turn back. When the ship finally dropped out of transit at the very edge of the exclusion boundary, close enough to observe but, I hoped, far enough to remain unnoticed, I stood alone at the observation window and looked, for the first time in my life, at the star the compact had spent centuries teaching itself to forget. It was, by every objective measure, an unremarkable star. Ordinary in size, ordinary in temperature, nothing about its light suggested the centuries of careful, guarded fear that surrounded it. I activated the ship's passive sensors, set carefully to remain undetectable by anything short of the most advanced technology, and began, slowly, to gather what I had traveled so far to find. The first thing I noticed was how much activity there was. I had expected, based on everything I had read, a system still largely confined to its own gravity well, its inhabitants unaware of the vast, careful silence surrounding them. Instead, my sensors picked up dozens of small vessels moving through the outer reaches of the system, more than I had anticipated for a species the compact's own records described as technologically limited compared to galactic standards. I adjusted my sensors further and began intercepting fragments of broadcast signal, the same kind of chaotic, undirected transmissions Cole had described so many centuries earlier. But where Cole's records described a scattered, uncertain species still finding its footing, what I intercepted now felt different, more confident, more expansive. I heard fragments of conversation between vessels, casual exchanges between crew members coordinating supply runs, discussing repairs, arguing good-naturedly about matters that seemed, from what I could translate, almost entirely unrelated to any of the careful, guarded concerns I had spent so many days studying. A voice, identified by the ship's automatic translation as belonging to someone named Daniel Cross, laughed through a burst of static as he described, to another crew member, an argument he had apparently had the previous evening about the best way to prepare a meal neither of them had access to the proper ingredients for. Another voice, belonging to a woman named Claire Dawson, complained cheerfully about a delayed shipment, then immediately pivoted to asking after the health of someone's family member, her tone warm despite the mild frustration underlying her words. I found myself listening longer than I had intended, drawn in by something I had not expected to find here at the edge of a system every elder in the compact had spent centuries teaching themselves to fear. There was an ease to these conversations, a casual, unguarded quality that felt entirely at odds with the tense, careful reports I had spent so many days absorbing. These were not soldiers preparing for conflict. These were not survivors bracing for disaster. These were simply people, going about ordinary lives, unaware that anything about their existence had ever been considered remarkable, let alone frightening. I widened my sensor range slightly, still careful to remain within the limits of passive, undetectable observation, and began cataloging what I could of the system's outer activity. Small trade vessels, research platforms, what appeared to be recreational craft, their designs suggesting purposes entirely unrelated to survival or conflict. I found broadcasts that seemed to be nothing more than entertainment, stories and music and casual conversation transmitted freely across the system, with no apparent concern for who might be listening. It struck me, somewhere in the middle of that long, quiet observation, how strange it was to reconcile what I was seeing now with everything I had learned. This was not a species crouched in permanent readiness, bracing endlessly for the next disaster, the next conflict, the next hopeless standoff that would call forward the terrifying pattern documented so carefully across centuries of compact records. This was a species living, in this particular moment, an ordinary life, full of small frustrations and small joys, entirely unaware of the quiet, careful fear that surrounded them from every direction. And yet I knew, from everything Orgath had shown me, from every log Cole and Voss and Whitfield had left behind, that beneath this ordinary surface lay something the compact had never found the bottom of. A capacity, dormant now, quiet now, that could awaken instantly given the right pressure, the right threat, the right moment of shared, desperate purpose. I continued my observation for several more hours, gathering fragments of broadcast, cataloging vessel movements, building a picture of a system that felt, in this quiet moment, almost peaceful. I intercepted a transmission from someone named Henry Voss, no relation, as far as I could determine, to the commander whose report had shaped so much of the Council's fear centuries earlier. casually discussing plans for what sounded like a celebration, his voice light and unhurried. I intercepted another exchange between two voices identified as Grace Whitfield and Peter Bennett, discussing, with obvious affection, a shared project they had apparently been working on together for some time, their conversation full of easy laughter and small, comfortable disagreements about details that mattered only to them. I realized, somewhere in the middle of cataloging these small, ordinary exchanges, that I had stopped thinking of this system as a threat to be studied, and started thinking of it as something else entirely. Not dangerous in this moment, not hostile in this moment, simply alive, in a way that felt more vivid, more immediate, than anything I had encountered in all my years cataloging the quiet, careful, predictable rhythms of galactic civilization. It was that thought, more than any warning Orgath had given me, that finally made me understand what the Compact truly feared. Not a monster, not a weapon, a species so full of ordinary, unremarkable life, so capable of warmth and laughter and small, comfortable joy, that no one could quite reconcile that ordinary life with the terrifying pattern hidden just beneath its surface, waiting, patiently, for a moment desperate enough to call it forward. I was still turning that thought over in my mind when my sensors registered something that made my breath catch in my throat. A small, unarmed vessel, moving slowly along the very edge of the exclusion boundary, close enough that for one impossible moment, I wondered if it had somehow detected my presence despite every precaution I had taken. And then, carried on a frequency far too broad and far too open to be anything but deliberate, I heard a voice, warm and curious and entirely unafraid, sending a simple, cheerful greeting out into the vast, listening dark. I sat frozen at the observation window, every instinct in my body telling me to power down the sensors, retreat into transit, and put as much distance as possible between myself and that small, unarmed vessel drifting along the edge of the boundary. But I did not move. I could not move. I simply listened, my breath caught somewhere in my chest, as the voice continued, cheerful and unhurried, repeating what I now understood was some kind of general greeting, sent outward without any apparent expectation of a reply, sent simply because someone aboard that vessel had decided, for reasons I could not begin to guess, that the vast, empty dark deserved to be greeted rather than feared. The translation, when my systems finally processed it, was almost painfully ordinary. A simple hello, a brief mention of the vessel's name, an open invitation for anyone listening to respond if they wished, followed by a short burst of something my systems identified, after a moment, as laughter, as if the person speaking found some private humor in the act of broadcasting a greeting into what most reasonable observers would assume was empty space. I sat with that laughter for a long time after the transmission ended, letting it settle into everything I had learned over the preceding weeks. I thought of Cole's careful unease. I thought of Voss's warning about a species whose resolve had no measurable ceiling. I thought of 3 injured survivors who had refused to stop resisting even when every reasonable calculation said resistance was pointless. And now, layered over all of that, I had this, a voice, warm and curious, sending a small hopeful greeting out into the dark, entirely unaware of the centuries of careful, guarded fear surrounding the very space it was broadcasting into. It was in that moment, sitting alone at the edge of a boundary an entire galaxy had spent generations avoiding, that I finally understood what Orgath had been trying to tell me from the very first conversation in their chamber. It was never about strength. I had spent weeks assuming, in some quiet corner of my mind, that the terrifying reason behind the Compact's fear must eventually reveal some hidden weapon, some secret capability, some technological advantage humanity had developed beyond what our sensors could detect. But that was never the answer, and some part of me realized, sitting there in the dark, that I had been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Every species the Compact had ever catalogued, including my own, carried within it an instinctive understanding of when a cause had become unwinnable. It was not weakness, it was wisdom, built into the deepest architecture of a species' behavior across countless generations, a survival mechanism that prevented endless, pointless destruction in pursuit of causes already lost. Every model the Compact used to maintain its long, careful peace relied on that instinct being present, being reliable, being universal. Humanity did not carry that instinct in the same way, or if they did, it required a pressure so extreme, so absolute, that nothing in their recorded history had ever found its true limit. And a species without a reliable ceiling on how far it would go, how long it would resist, how much it would sacrifice rather than accept an ending imposed from outside, was not a species that could be safely modeled, safely predicted, safely contained within the comfortable frameworks the Compact had spent countless generations building. That was the terrifying reason, not a weapon, not a fleet, not some hidden technological advantage waiting to be unveiled. It was the simple, unshakable fact that humanity did not know how to give up, and no one, not the oldest elder, not the most careful strategist, not the most sophisticated simulation the Compact had ever built, could confidently predict what a species with that particular flaw, or perhaps that particular gift, might eventually become, if ever pushed far enough, or united enough, or given enough time to grow into whatever shape that endless, unyielding resolve was capable of taking. I thought of the ordinary voices I had intercepted only hours earlier, the casual laughter, the small complaints about delayed shipments, the warm affection in conversations between people who had no idea anything about their existence had ever been considered remarkable. That ordinary warmth was not separate from the terrifying pattern documented so carefully across centuries of careful observation. It was the same thing, viewed from a different angle. The same capacity for connection, for care, for stubborn devotion to the people and things they loved, that made humanity capable of laughing so easily into the empty dark, was the very same capacity that made them refuse to surrender when everything else had already been lost. It was not two different traits sitting uneasily side by side inside the same species. It was one single thing, one continuous thread running through every part of who they were, gentle and fierce at once, depending entirely on what circumstance called it forward. I understood, finally, why the elders could not look away from this, even as they built an entire architecture of silence to avoid ever having to face it directly. It was not simply fear, though fear was certainly part of it. It was something closer to a kind of helpless fascination, the same fascination I now felt myself, sitting alone at the edge of a boundary I had traveled so far and risked so much to reach, unable to stop listening to a voice that had no idea it was being heard at all. The small vessel drifted further along the boundary as I watched, its cheerful, open broadcast continuing at intervals, unanswered and apparently unbothered by the silence that met it every time. I found myself wondering, as I finally forced myself to power down my sensors and prepare for the long journey back toward compact space, what that person aboard the vessel might think if they ever learned the truth. That an entire galaxy of ancient, powerful civilizations had spent centuries building careful walls of silence around their small, ordinary world, not because they believed humanity intended harm, but because they could not bear the uncertainty of not knowing what humanity might become if that harm was ever aimed toward them directly. I did not know, sitting there in the quiet dark, whether that uncertainty would last forever. I did not know whether some future council, faced with new evidence, new patterns, new incidents impossible to predict, might finally choose a different path than the one chosen so many centuries ago in a chamber divided almost evenly for 3 long days. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep and permanent into my chest as the ship carried me back toward the careful, guarded safety of compact space, that I would never again be able to look at a star chart, a survey report, or a single blank, empty entry in the galaxy's vast catalog of known worlds, without thinking of that small, unafraid voice, laughing softly into the dark, entirely unaware of just how closely, and how carefully, the entire galaxy had learned to listen. The return journey gave me more time than I wanted to think about what I had seen, and what I now understood, and what, if anything, I intended to do with that understanding once I returned to the quiet, ordinary rhythm of my work in the cartography wing. I arrived back at the Compact's central archive tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical strain of travel, carrying a weight of knowledge I was not certain I would ever be able to fully set down again. Orgath was waiting for me, which did not surprise me as much as it perhaps should have. I found them in the same chamber, seated near the same window, looking out at the same distant, scattered lights that had been there the very first night I came to them with questions I did not yet understand the danger of asking. "You went to the boundary," Orgath said, before I had even fully entered the room. It was not a question. "I did," I said, deciding there was little point in denying it, or in pretending I had not done exactly what Orgath had likely suspected I would do from the very beginning of our conversations. "And what did you find?" Orgath asked, though something in their tone suggested they already had a guess. One built from centuries of watching others arrive at the same quiet, unsettling understanding I now carried. I told them everything. The trade vessels moving through the outer system. The casual, ordinary broadcasts full of laughter and small complaints, and warm, unguarded affection. The small, unarmed vessel drifting along the very edge of the boundary, sending its cheerful, hopeful greeting out into the listening dark without any expectation of reply. Orgath listened without interrupting, their expression unreadable, until I finally reached the end of my account and fell silent, uncertain what to say next. "You understand now," Orgath said finally, "why silence was chosen. Not distance for its own sake, not fear for its own sake, but the simple, unbearable recognition that a species capable of that kind of warmth, that kind of ordinary, unguarded joy, is the very same species capable of the resolve we documented so carefully across centuries of careful, cautious observation. It is not two things sitting uneasily together. It is one single thing, and there is no way to separate the warmth from the resolve, no way to have one without risking the other. I understand, I said quietly, but I do not know if I agree that silence is truly the safest path, or the only path. Orgath studied me for a long moment, and something in their ancient face shifted, softened, in a way I had not seen before across all our conversations. Neither do I, Orgath admitted, so quietly I almost missed it. I have never been entirely certain silence was the right choice, only the choice that required the least confidence in our own ability to predict what might happen otherwise. There is a difference between the safest path and the right path, and I have spent longer than you can imagine wondering whether the Council, in its caution, may have simply chosen the path that was easiest to defend, rather than the path that was truly best for anyone involved. I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling something in my understanding of the entire situation shift slightly, settling into a shape I had not expected. What happens now, I asked, now that I know? That depends on you, Orgath said. I cannot force you to forget what you have learned, and I would not want to, even if I could. Every generation, a handful of curious minds find their way to this knowledge, as you have. Most, once they understand the full weight of it, choose to carry it quietly, the way I have carried it, adding their voice to the careful, patient watch that has been maintained for centuries. Some choose differently. I do not know which path you will choose, and I do not believe it is my place to decide that for you. I thought about the file that had started all of this, the strange red alarm that had woken me from sleep, the mostly empty entry with its stark, simple warning. Do not engage, do not study, do not remember. I understood now that the warning had never truly been about protecting the compact from humanity's weapons, or humanity's technology, or any conventional measure of danger the galaxy knew how to defend against. It had been about protecting the compact from the discomfort of uncertainty itself, from having to sit, generation after generation, with a question no one had ever found the courage or the confidence to answer directly. I returned to my post in the cartography wing the following day, and I did rewrite the file, though not in the way the Council might have expected. I did not add new warnings, new restrictions, new careful walls of language designed to discourage the next curious archivist who might one day stumble across that same red alarm. Instead, I added a single new entry, brief and carefully worded, appended quietly to the bottom of a file that had remained almost entirely empty for centuries. Observation continues. Conclusion remains open. It was not much. I understood that even as I filed it, understood that it would likely go unnoticed by all but the most careful future reader, buried as it was beneath layers of far older, far more forceful warnings. But it felt to me like the truest thing I could add to a file built almost entirely on the absence of understanding rather than its presence. The compact had spent centuries choosing silence because it could not confidently predict what humanity might become. I had spent weeks learning enough to understand why that silence made a kind of painful, cautious sense. But I had also spent one quiet evening listening to a voice laugh softly into the dark, warm and curious, and entirely unafraid, and I could not bring myself to close that file with the same absolute certainty the Council had once used to seal it away. Some nights, when my work is finished and the archive around me has gone quiet, I find myself returning to that small, cheerful transmission, replaying it in my memory, wondering about the person who sent it, wondering whether they ever imagined, even for a moment, that somewhere in the vast, listening dark, an entire galaxy of ancient, careful civilizations had built their deepest fear around the simple, unshakable fact that their species did not know how to stop hoping, did not know how to stop reaching outward, did not know, even in the face of an uncaring universe that had never once answered back, how to stop believing that someone, somewhere, might be listening. I do not know what the future holds for the quiet, careful watch the compact has maintained for so many centuries. I do not know whether some future council will finally find the courage to answer that small, hopeful greeting, or whether silence will continue, generation after generation, until humanity finds its own way to the stars regardless of what any distant, ancient alliance decides. But I know this much, carried with me now every time I look up at the scattered lights of the archive's endless star charts. Somewhere out there, beyond the careful boundary an entire galaxy has learned to avoid, a small, unarmed vessel is still drifting through the dark, still sending its cheerful greeting outward into the silence, still waiting, patiently and without complaint, for someone brave enough to finally answer.